Hi, everyone, and welcome. It is wonderful to see you here this evening as we are gathering for another incredible author event, this time with Helene Wecker, who is the author of, as probably most of you know and have already read, The Golem and the Genie, and now the sequel to that book, The Hidden Palace. Her books have appeared on the New York Times and San Francisco Chronicle's bestseller lists, have won a National Jewish Book Award, the VCU Cable Award, the Harold U. Ribelow Prize, and a I can't even say this word, which is embarrassing, a poet, Helene, can you say it? A Poet Award. She currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her family, but could you just tell me how to say that word first before you do anything else?
Mythopoeic. You were right.
Mythopoeic. It's an incredible word, and I'm kind of sad that I'm not exactly sure what it means, but we're so happy to welcome you. I'm going to turn things over to you now. Welcome, Helene Wecker.
Thank you. I probably shouldn't include. Well, I kind of want to include that one on the bio because I'm proud of it because it's an award given to books written in the spirit of J.R.R. Tolkien, and so that was it was I was really shocked when I got that award, but no one knows how to say it, and so it always trips everyone up, and it's like, oh well. Anyway, hello everyone. It is wonderful to be here among you. Thank you so much for coming. And I do wish we could be doing this in person. I guess we'll just have to be dealing with all of this for a little while longer. This way, however, you get to see my bedroom. You get to see the quilt my mother-in-law made. And I apologize in advance if my son runs in and tells you all about dinosaur facts. That is his usual MO. I will try to get him out of the room as fast as possible if that happens. Anyway, I thought that I would start at the sort of the beginning. Usually people ask me, when I come to do a book club, it's sort of what prompted you to write these books in the first place. They're not the most obvious books to write, apparently. Usually people want to know, okay, how did this happen? So I thought I would give you a bit of a story on how these books came to be. So I grew up a Jewish girl in the Chicago suburbs, in a town called Libertyville, if any of you are familiar with the greater Chicagoland area. So I was a child of the 80s, and I was a nerd pretty much straight out of the womb. I watched a lot of Star Trek, a lot of Doctor Who. I read a lot of Bradbury and Heinlein, lots of books with dragons on the covers. And I also wrote, though mostly, at first I was just mimicking the stories that I loved so much. And then, I got older. I went to college. I went to Carleton in Minnesota. I got my degree in English, which involved reading a lot of British Romantic poets. I took a few creative writing classes while I was there. I seemed to do okay in them. But even though I loved writing, those classes to me felt like the treats that I was allowing myself, instead of, the actual real work, because real work was what was going to lead to a real job, an actual job with a salary and a 401k and so on. So 4 years of college, I graduated. I got that job with the salary and the 401k in marketing and communications. And I spent the next 7 years, the greater part of my 20s, being absolutely miserable in a career that I hated. And then finally, I decided that my life had to change. I had to take my own writing seriously. And that led me to apply to master's programs in creative writing. I was absolutely gobsmacked when Columbia University decided to let me in. So I proposed to my boyfriend. And I said, will you go to New York with me? And he said, yes, but I have to go to Los Alamos first to New Mexico to do my PhD research. And I said, okay. And so I went off to New York, all full of excitement and giant expectations for myself. When you arrive at Columbia or a program like it, immediately they tell you you have to start thinking about your creative writing thesis. What is your thesis going to be? And if, in an MFA program, a thesis is your body of creative work. It's going to represent your abilities come graduation. And it's also sort of expected that it's going to be part of like a short story collection or a novel, that's going to be your first attempt at getting published. So I came up with the idea pretty much like when I arrived that I was going to write a linked collection of short stories. And these were going to be real life tales, very realist tales, taken from my own family history and from my then fiance, now husband's family history. And I was prompted to write it as a Jewish American woman married to an Arab American man. And I'd always been impressed by the similarities in our family's histories, especially around the experience of immigration to America. And I've known him since I was 18. So my family's, at this point, I'm in my, I'm basically 30. His family's history was just about as well known to me as my own. And it always seems so similar to me how that legacy of immigration was between our families, the pride and the uncertainty and the strangeness of being new to a country, and having to deal with issues of language and culture and the push and pull of living in one place while also carrying the burden of another place's history, and then being the child of an immigrant and having that burden sort of passed down to you. So you're living with, the baggage or like sort of the cultural memory of a place that you may not even have ever been to. And how that can make you feel like you're never going to quite fit in anywhere. So I had a lot of good material here, I thought at least. And so I tried to write these stories that were sort of set in different generations of our families. And there was this Jewish girl and this Arab American boy that were sort of threading through the stories, and they would meet up every once in a while. But the problem that I started running into was that the stories just weren't very good. I think part of this was that I wasn't a very good writer yet. I was like too new at it. I didn't know what I was doing. I needed a lot of practice. But more than that, in a sense, I think I was just too familiar with these stories already, because I had been hearing these stories, most of my life. And writing them felt like retelling something I already knew instead of discovering something as I wrote it. And so they just sort of lacked energy, and they just sort of like arrived a little flat on the page. And I was getting feedback from my creative writing from my workshop, my classmates in my workshop, that was basically saying, yeah, these, there's a couple that are okay, and the rest of them, it's like, yeah, okay, well, you're just going to need to work on that for a while. They don't mince words at Columbia. You're paying a lot of money to get very honest opinions. So that was, and it was a learning process, and I knew it was going to be a learning process going in, but I was also just feeling really low about this. It was like, this is the stuff that I want to be better at. I just spent a whole lot of money and put aside a whole career so that I could do something better and be better at something. And I wasn't there yet. And it was just frustrating me that these stories were just actively like not working. And then I was complaining about this to a friend of mine in the program, and who was in my class and had been reading along these stories. And she sort of turned to me at one point and said, during this like discussion we were having, and she said, Helene, why are you writing like this? And I said, writing like what? What are you writing like? Oh, sorry, someone just let the dog in. Just a second. No, thank you. Oh, a little anarchy. Always good for keeping me on my toes. Anyway, so she said, Helene, why are you writing like this? And I said, writing like what? What am I writing like? And she said, I know you. I've been to your apartment. I know what you read. I know what a nerd you are. You are always talking about genre and the use of the fantastical in literary fiction. And you just like talk about this all day long and you bore us to death with it. So why aren't you doing this yourself? Because that's where your heart is. And I was like, I had it just shocked me that as soon as she said it, it was like, well, why aren't I? That makes perfect sense. Um, so she said, okay, the next thing I see from you in workshop, it can be about your families if you want, but I want you to make it fantastical. I was like, okay, okay. So I just sort of took that as my marching orders and I went back to my apartment and I sat there and I was like, okay, so what if instead of the Jewish girl and the Arab American boy, what if we switched them up? What if we made them sort of the most emblematic folkloric creature from each culture? I don't know. We'll make them a golem and a genie. And it was pretty much instantly that I saw these two figures in front of me. There was this tall woman who looked sort of shy and a little unsure of herself, and this equally tall man who looked very handsome and a bit of a bad boy. I was like, ooh, okay, what am I going to do with you two? Okay, I will put you in New York at the turn of the 20th century, and you're both immigrants, and you're going to somehow meet up. And I just started writing, and it became like by the end of that day, I had the first dozen or so pages of what later became the Golem and the Genie. Um, and I took it to workshop and I said, okay, here's the beginning of a new short story that I'm working on. Let me know what you think. And they read it and they got back to me and said, okay, this is better and more interesting than anything you've given us so far. So that's good. But what you need to know is this isn't a short story, it's a novel. And you're just going to have to deal with that. And I didn't believe them. I was like, this is just a fun thing I'm writing, and then I got to get back to like the real, the I don't know, the actual writing, the serious writing. And so, so I kept writing, and I kept writing and writing and writing, and I'm like, it started to feel like I was chasing the horizon, the story just getting longer and longer and longer. And at some point, I had to admit, oh God, they're right. This is a novel. It is a very big novel, and it's going to take an awful lot of research if I want to do it right. So at some point, I just sort of gave in. Because I went to the library and sat there for, the better part of a year just researching. Because I had no idea. I had no idea about any of the stuff that I had decided to write about sort of on a whim. Down to the everyday stuff, like what did people wear back then? What did they eat? What did a typical day look like? I had to learn about the Jewish Lower East Side, which I thought I knew about, from popular culture. I'd seen Funny Girl. Everyone sings all the time and they eat cabbages. No, it's more than that. I had such a simple idea of what Jewish life in New York was at that time, and that got turned on its head pretty much as soon as I started researching, because I had no idea just how many different flavors of Judaism were flourishing there. It wasn't like the homogenous Orthodox Judaism that I imagined. It was a hotbed of the progressive movement and socialism and the labor movement. I had to learn about Little Syria, which I hadn't even known existed before I started researching. I also didn't know that most of the Syrians who were in the US at that time were actually Christian and not Muslim. I wasn't expecting that. Now I have to learn about Maronite Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity. These are two religions I knew absolutely nothing about. I had to research Jewish and Arab folklore, Bedouin culture, what felt like a million subjects. So, and I knew that we were going to be going, moving from New York at some point. And so, it's just me and the photocopier in the Columbia Library with a stack like this big because, I knew at some point I was going to be leaving and I'd have to take all this information with me. And as the book grew, I became more and more grateful for that conversation that I'd had with my friend, because I realized it was letting me create something larger and more malleable than my own family stories, while also addressing the original ideas that I'd been trying to write about in the first place. Because sort of by accident, I created like the ultimate immigrants who aren't just new to America or to New York, they're new to people. And like everyone else, they have to learn things like the streetcar schedules and how to get an apartment and stuff like that. But they also have to learn how to eat because it looks sort of suspicious if you never eat. And then there's the question of what to do in New York at night if you don't sleep. If you're a guy like Ahmad the Genie, it's fine, you can go exploring. But women, generally, you don't walk around after dark in 1899 New York. People might think you are a prostitute or no better than one. So she's stuck in her apartment all night and it starts to drive her a little nuts. And then I have to figure out how to handle that. So those are the day-to-day issues that they have to deal with. But they also think about the big questions like why they're there and their purpose in life. And for not like the 2 a.m. way that we tend to, but it's very much on the surface for them, thanks to these inescapable aspects of their own natures. This is the stuff that they have to figure out in order to live in the world among humans. And this was the same internal clash that so many immigrants felt to land in this new culture with this very modern world of America with all the good and ill that went with that. And bumping up against new ideas and so many varieties and permutations, and how some immigrants just jumped into the stew of new ideologies headlong. Others spent their lives building barricades against it. Many fell somewhere in the middle, as many of us still do now, trying to decide what we believe in, what traditions to keep, which new ideas to adopt. And I had to figure out how Chava and Ahmad would sort of mirror that in their own lives. And so altogether, The Golem and the Genie took about 7 years to write. It came out in 2013. It was a decent success, thanks to a good deal of luck, a lot of support from booksellers and book groups and librarians. And so it wasn't too long before I started thinking about writing the next book. At that point, my life looked a lot different than it had back when I first started writing. My husband had found a job in the Bay Area. We had moved from Manhattan to Pleasanton, California. A brief stint in Oakland before that, and then we moved over the ridge to Pleasanton. And at this point, we had a 3-year-old girl and a new baby boy. And so I had an actual life now. I couldn't just hide in the house and write all day in my bathrobe. And meanwhile, readers were starting to ask, "Are you going to write a sequel?" I was like, "Okay, I think I could. I think there's like some life in these characters. So sure, why not? It's got to be easier than starting something from scratch." Famous last words. So I wrote an outline. I wrote a few test chapters. My publisher gave me a contract to sign and we were off. So by now I'd been a writer for long enough to hear any number of other writers say that it never gets easier, that every book brings you back to the beginning stage. Every book is just as difficult as the first. Every book makes you feel like an utter failure and a poser, and how did they even let you write that first book in the first place? And I was like, and it's one of those truths where it's like, that's the same as parenting is hard, where it's like, you sort of nod and you go, yes, I know that must be, but you don't know. You don't really know until it happens. And so I had to sort of learn this truth in my bones. Because what I hadn't realized when I decided to write a sequel was that already having the characters and the setting and the rules that they live by doesn't necessarily make it any easier. In fact, it can make it harder. Because when I'd first created Chava and Ahmad, I'd been completely free to sort of mold them to the particular story that I wanted to tell. And I'd sort of designed them to be polar opposites. That Chava is by nature a very shy and cautious person. Ahmad is very mercurial and free-spirited. Because I wanted them to connect with each other despite their differences as they are brought together by their common experiences. But now here I am writing a new book with two protagonists who are set in their ways. They have history, both separate and together. They have baggage that they come with. I have to honor that. I have to stay true to who they are. But at the same time, I have to find ways for them to change. Because to me, a story isn't worth telling unless a character has somehow changed by the end of it. And I didn't know if they could change. And that seemed like a pretty big problem to me. But as I was facing this problem, what happened was, and this is something that's like happened to me numerous times in my writing process, the problem itself sort of at some point just turns around and becomes the solution to the problem, because pretty soon the entire book became about this question of change and how much is it possible to change. So for instance, I'd ended The Golem and the Genie with the suggestion that Chava and Ahmad were about to take the next step in their relationship, possibly even turn it into a romance. So at least part of this book had to be about that evolution, how it was going to play out against this larger struggle of their lives. And that was going to be a pretty big challenge because they are opposites by nature. You know, Chava can hear the desires and fears of others. She's in essence programmed to want to help them. And that gives her much more of an incentive to fit in and pass as human. But that power, that empathic power that she has, doesn't work on Ahmad. She can't read him, which means that at a certain level, she can't understand him. And she can't help wishing that he was different than he is. Ahmad, on the other hand, has very little interest in fitting in. He was stolen away from his life in the desert. He has a people and a culture and a language that he has no access to anymore. And he doesn't want to change at all any more than he absolutely has to. He fights it tooth and nail. And Chava's relative ease at blending in, her desire to blend in, makes her feel totally alien to him. So what happens when these two try to be more than just allies against a common problem the way they were in the first book? What happens when they try to be in an actual meaningful relationship with each other? And if you've ever been in a meaningful relationship with anyone ever, you know that part of that is about change and compromise. So clearly this isn't going to be an easy romance, but what does that look like on the page? How will their arguments change now that they have the power to really wound each other the way that lovers do? Can they actually share their feelings and make themselves vulnerable to each other in that way? Or are they going to end up hiding from each other just as much as they hide from the people around them? So that was like the first element of change I had to like address head on. The next regarded the amount of time that the book was going to cover. The first book, if you read it, you know it takes place over roughly a single year. It's from 1899 to 1900. And one of the first big decisions I made about the second book was that it was going to cover a much larger amount of time, because I wanted Chava and Ahmad to watch the world change around them. I wanted us to see those changes through their eyes, because they are supernatural creatures. And I established in the first book that Jinn have a lifespan of roughly 800 years. Ahmad's only lived about 200 of those so far. Chava, she's basically ageless and immortal. She is always going to be exactly as she was built until the day she is destroyed, if that ever happens. But they are living in a city that is constantly changing around them, and the people around them are getting older. The kids are growing up. Sometimes someone gets sick and injured. Sometimes they recover, sometimes they don't. And no matter how good you are pretending to be human, if you work at a bakery for years on end without aging a single day, someone is going to notice eventually. And then what happens? So I decided that the book would take us from 1900 to 1915, which were some pretty momentous years in American life. The women's suffrage movement was starting to gain traction. Mass production and industrialization were really starting to change the way people lived and worked, how the cities themselves were being built. This is also pretty much the point at which sort of the tipping point, it's either these years or slightly after, where the majority of American population lived in cities instead of rurally. And so for the Jews of the Lower East Side, there was a certain amount of upward mobility happening. But incidents like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire made it pretty clear that people in power still considered immigrant lives to be cheap and disposable. And there was always the specter of the pogroms happening in the Russian Empire and threatening family elsewhere. And for the community of Little Syria, the beginning of World War I led to new fears for their own families in Lebanon, who were being gradually starved by the Ottoman Empire, who were sending all the food to the front, to the troops. And what ended up happening was estimates are literally half of Lebanon starved to death. So how is this going to affect Chava and Ahmad? How might Chava decide to change with the times? How would Ahmad manage to keep all this human upheaval from affecting him? What might he lose in the process? And while I was at it, I decided to throw a few new characters into the mix. As part of my research, I'd read about the Odessa pogrom of 1905 and the protest parade that was held in New York City as a response. And I decided that maybe for one Lower East Side rabbi, his own response might be to build a golem, a more traditional, huge, hulking creature that he names Yasala, and that through a twist of fate, Yasala ends up being bound to the rabbi's young daughter instead of himself. And the daughter, Kreindl, would end up at a Jewish orphanage up in Hamilton Heights, where she has to hide Yasala from the rest of the residents. And incidentally, many you may know, being sort of in the vicinity, that orphanage is based on the real life Hebrew Orphan Asylum, which existed there at the time in Hamilton Heights. It was a fascinating place to read about and research. It was founded by these German Jewish philanthropists, the big names, to take in Eastern European immigrant children. And they saved a lot of kids' lives. There's absolutely no doubt of that. But at the same time, their mission pretty explicitly was to Americanize and assimilate the kids and sort of scrub the dirt of the old country off them. And so and basically to like turn them into German Jewish Reformed Jews instead of the Polish and Romanian and Ukrainian Jews that they were at the time. So on visiting days, the families who had brought their kids up to the orphanage because they couldn't afford to keep them, the parents would the families would come uptown, and there would be this like really tragic scene where the orphanage kids had forgotten all their Yiddish because they weren't allowed to speak Yiddish, while the families hadn't learned enough English yet, so they couldn't even talk to each other anymore. And that to me sounded like a deeply lonely existence, even if you crammed in with 1,000 other kids who were in exactly the same position that you are. And then, here's Kreindl on top of that with her own, rather phenomenal secret that would just distance her more from the people she's living around. So that was one new set of characters, Kreindl and Yasala. And there was another character that I wanted to add. In the first book, we meet Sophia Winston, who is the daughter of one of the richest families in New York. I added her to the first book basically because I decided the Genie needed a girlfriend. And so I came up with this debutante. And then to me, she became to my shock, she became one of the most interesting people in the book. And in that book, she and Ahmad have a brief romantic fling, but something goes wrong and she ends up with this mysterious illness that makes her constantly shake with cold. So I decided to bring Sophia back and I gave her a larger role. So at the start of The Hidden Palace, she journeys to the Middle East to search for a cure for her condition. And while she's there, she has all sorts of adventures. Those were a lot of fun to research and write. And all the while she's looking for a cure. And then one day in the middle of the Syrian desert, she meets Dima, this female Jinniya, who has been exiled from her own tribe for her own secret condition. And Dima decides that she wants Sophia to take her to America so she can meet Ahmad. So now what's going to happen when Chava and Ahmad encounter these two who are sort of these mirror versions of themselves, but in a more traditional form? What sorts of temptations are going to come to the surface and, uncomfortable truths? And more to the point, might Chava and Ahmad discover that after so long around humans, they've assimilated either deliberately or without even realizing it to the point where they are now in essence, strangers to their own kind. So it took me a long time to answer all of these questions to my own satisfaction and to sort of to fashion, a compelling narrative around them. In the end, the second book took 7 years, again, just as long as the first, if not longer, I think. And someone pointed out to me recently that I have now been living with these characters for going on 15 years. And they feel to me like family in the way that you can sort of know a loved one inside out, and yet they still have the power to absolutely baffle you, and you have no idea what they're going to do in a given situation. But getting to write their stories really has been one of the greatest gifts and privileges of my life. And I am continuing on to a book 3. We are, I am in the beginning throes of writing book 3. Hopefully it will not take another 7 years. I don't think I could stand it. I think my family would actually fire me from my job as mom, and say, sorry, we're getting someone else now who doesn't drive us crazy. But I hope that I hope that I can, in the hopefully not too distant future, come back and talk with you about book 3 as well. And I hope that when you read these stories, even though Chava and Ahmad are sort of impossible creatures who never could have existed, I hope that they do feel just a little bit familiar. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, I think, yeah, amazing. So fascinating to hear also just the process for, how you develop these characters, how they were born and how you develop them, and the story, the lives that you were able to create for them. I'm just looking at the people, looking at the faces, are a lot of really amazed faces. So I want to turn it over to the people who are here, who if people have questions, you can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hands. And I'm going to start with Marcia and Mark, if that's okay. You can just know that I'm always going to start with you. So we're going to go with you guys first.
Of course. So I have a comment, and then Mark, I think, has a question. So I want to say kudos to you on the research you did.
Thank you.
Not just on the events and the visual, feeling the time and place and everything, but some of the things that I wouldn't have even thought to question that you came up with. We just read another book that was just full of anachronisms, and it made me crazy. But but subtle things in your book, like a woman can't own property, so they had to create a dummy company for that. I mean, that's not something you would just run into while researching, necessarily researching the time and place. So I was very impressed with that. But I am also very curious about what kinds of, other things about the research you did and what didn't make it its way into the book. But let me have.
All right. Actually, well, first of all, I assume I have another Dragon Riders of Pern fan here.
Oh, I missed out on Anne Caffrey. She was Anne McCaffrey. She I somehow skipped her. I don't know how it happened.
Yeah, you're doing dragons. I don't know how you missed. Okay.
I was Dragonlance. That was my big one, was Dragonlance.
Okay.
But my roommate in college was a huge Anne McCaffrey fan, and she had every single book. And so I sort of, by osmosis, became a, by association, an Anne McCaffrey fan.
Yeah. Okay, so my question is, and I'd like to expand on you to expand on your comments about the orphanage. Another place in your book too, the whole struggle of the secular Jewish organizations, which were really hell-bent to get these people assimilated, which in some ways, they thought was for their better good, and maybe it was. But I mean, what do you think about that dilemma? What was the right thing to do?
It's so hard to say. Well, no, I don't think it is. In some ways it is, in some ways it isn't, because you have this whole thing with, look at things like hygiene, where it was, you know, the women, the settlement workers going from apartment to apartment, you know, offering women milk and eggs if you'll let me teach you how to cook correctly. You know, let me teach you how to be an American and keep a clean American kitchen. And what ended up happening was all of this stuff got conflated, like modernity got sort of just braided in with secularism. And it's like, if you could just take that apart and be like, okay, here is how to keep Orthodox kosher kitchen in a high, you know, in a manner where, you know, we do have modern refrigeration. We do know now about uh, you know, microbes and using, you know, bleach or whatever, you know, at the time. It's like, if you can do that, there is a way to do that that does not like denigrate the culture that comes along with it. But everyone was just throwing the whole baby out with the bathwater on that front, and you know, in a very deliberate manner, because it was like, you know, all these new Jews, they're shaming us, they're making us, you know, they're yokels, and they don't, you know, they're going to make people hate them, and then people are going to hate us too. And so there was like a very defensive posture about that lent itself to, you know, a lot of sort of internal Jewish discrimination. And so it was what they knew to do at the time, you know, but it could have been handled a lot better.
And your research and what you found was interesting.
Oh, things, oh my goodness, things I found that I couldn't put in. There's a laundry list. The one that I had in that I had to take out because people told me that no one would believe it was that bakeries for Passover, the way that bakeries would get around having to throw out all the chametz on Passover was it became this sort of weird little legal tradition where a baker would find a Gentile and a willing Gentile and sell the bakery to the Gentile for the duration of Passover. So now they didn't have to throw everything out. They didn't have to, you know, waste a ton of money and time and throw out all their flour and clean everything because it wasn't theirs anymore. It belongs to this other guy. And then the contract would revert at the end of Passover back to the bakery owner. And I found this that like apparently a number of bakeries had done this. And I was like, that's so cool. That is just like that is the sort of legal Jewish loophole that I just live to see. And so I put it in that Radzin was going to sell his bakery to you know, some guy down the street, and everyone said, Helene, you can't do that. No one's going to believe it. Like people were like Jewish people, you know, friends and you know, readers were like, but that can't be. I'm like, it's right here in the research. And it sort of became this thing where it's like, even if you can't walk around, you can't like walk around to every reader when they get to a point where they're like, oh, come on. You can't be like, no, but that really happened. You know, you have to make it, you have to like sort of, what's the word? You have to assume that your reader is going to be a little skeptical. And so, you know, there were a few things where, you know, language that I would have thought was totally modern, like sayings that would have, you know, I would have thought, you know, didn't happen until like the 40s or the 50s. And people are saying them back in 1900s, 1910s. No one in my books says the word okay until like the end of the second book. I had Toby say it like once or twice because okay to my ear is just too modern of a word. And I don't know, maybe this is something that I just got way too, you know, hung up on. But it just didn't make sense to me that someone would say, okay, even if people were actually using it colloquially in like the 1900s. What other bits of research that just didn't make it in? Oh my gosh, especially for this book, so much on silent film. At one point, this book was about 800 things before I managed to like actually winnow it down to what it is. a lot. I spent like a month watching silent movies, and then I couldn't use any of it because I had a character who was going to be a Nickelodeon owner, and that just got tossed. There was just too much in the book, um, because there was this whole thing that I read about how silent film became so important for immigrants to sort of develop a common lexicon of American experience and American culture. That you paid your nickel and you went in and you saw the same movie that everyone else was watching. And you could understand what was going on because there's title cards occasionally that would come up, but most of the time you really didn't need them in order to know what was going on. So it was something they could plug into and just experience America alongside other Americans. Um, yeah, all sorts of stuff like that. It was, yeah, if I sat down and thought about it, I could talk for another hour about it, but I won't.
Thank you.
I see Roberta's hands raised. I'm going to call on you in 1 second, Roberta. I just want to say that I have a good friend many years ago who she sold her chametz to a neighbor, as people sometimes do. So she had all these really expensive like protein bars, like the kind bar, all that stuff. And
Oh yeah.
she sold it to him for $1, and he didn't understand that he wasn't supposed to eat it. So when she went to repurchase her chametz, back at the end of Passover, he was like, so anyway, I thought you would appreciate that story in light of the bakery story, but that's a true story. Roberta, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, actually, it's the same kind of comment that you just made. When you said you didn't think, or the publisher didn't think people would believe it. I mean, the rabbi had this story, but to me, it reminds me of the Shabbos goy.
Mm-hmm.
So you get around it by having a Gentile, turn on your light. So to me, that's definitely, I could see that was done then. And in terms of silent movies, what you had just referred to me, it's like immigrants that come to the United States today. No, they can't learn the language, through a silent movie, but they get assimilated pretty quickly through television.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really usually how they learn language. And so many of them from Sesame Street, when or even myself, when I watched, because I didn't take Spanish in school, I took French. But while my daughter was watching Sesame Street, I learned Spanish, to count to 10, and you learn some words. So that to me also sounds very familiar today as your reference to silent films then. But I did enjoy your presentation. You're a great speaker. So thank you for that. Okay.
I see Bela, you have your hand raised, and then Eileen will get to you next.
So as we're talking about this, I'm remembering more and more stuff that I was fascinated with in both books. But in the second book, hey, tell me a little bit about how you thought about the tower and the building of the tower and the whole metalworking thing and the glass. And that was fascinating.
That took a long time to come together. I had a number of different iterations of what exactly it was that he was going to build. I had, at one point, it was going to be that he was walking every night and collecting bits of the city, bits of buildings that were being torn down, and sort of using them to mosaic the inside of the Amherst. And that didn't really work because it didn't feel, I wanted him to be more isolated than that. I didn't want him to be walking around the city. When it came to the part of writing him when he's really going through this like period of grief and isolation, I was like, I need him to stay in the Amherst so that he becomes like almost like a myth, like a recluse who's, he's in there. He's like Willy Wonka in the chocolate factory. He's in there, but no one has ever seen him. And so at that point, I was like, okay, well, he can't be walking around the city. What does he have? What he has in there is steel. He can get the iron ore. He can make it, shape it himself. And that sort of became, okay, if he's going to build like a steel sculpture, what's it gonna look like? And if I can't see something, I can't write about it. I'm a very visual writer. I mean, that's why half of my research is like image search and you know, in the New York Public Library digital archives, looking through all their photos. Um, so I was like, I'm trying to describe this thing, and I'm like, I can't even figure out what it is I'm describing. So finally, I actually made a cardboard model of the inside of the Amherst as I wanted him to build it. And I had like this cube. I took photos of it. The whole thing fell apart, or I would actually show it to you. Um, it's like a cardboard cube that had open like a diorama, and I stuck a pencil in the middle, and I threaded a bunch of cardboard circles onto the pencil, and I rotated them so that it looked like a spiral. And then I just took photos from the top, from the sides, from everything, so that I could see, like, oh, if you're coming down at it from the top, it looks like this series of crescent moons that's sort of falling away from you. And if you're looking at it from the bottom, it's like you can, if you're standing on one of the circles, you can see, you know, like another platform above you is sort of like a half roof. And so, you know, and going up from there. And at that point, I could write about it in a way that actually made sense. I had to do some research on metal smithing. Watched a bunch of YouTube videos on metal smithing. There's one point earlier in the book where he's talking about how to or like you see him, it's called cold twisting an iron bar, where it's like he's holding it and you have to like rotate your whole body. I'm watching guys do this on YouTube, and then I'm like, I've got that on one side of the screen, on the other side of the screen I'm like typing away. So it's fun. The details are fun. They're also terrifying, because I know smart people read books and they will let you know if you get something wrong. And so you know, the fact that I'm not deluged in email makes me feel like I'm doing something right. But yeah, it's always a number of drafts till I figure stuff like that out. It's the details like that are just hard to pin down sometimes.
Thank you.
Judy Epstein.
I had, it's a wonderful story you tell, and your own story, and in addition to the one you wrote. And I just want to say, I've never heard anybody give as good a description of what it was like to be in a graduate writing program. I think everybody's kids here should watch this if they're remotely interested in it. And I'm very impressed that they were able to help you. I mean, it's interesting when the characters fell flat and you didn't know why. I've never known people who could help me figure that out. So that's,
Yeah,
I
I
guess
got lucky.
you got your money's worth, I guess. I wanted to say, keep that mythopoeic reference. It may get you a gig on Colbert.
Yes, yes.
Have your publicist work the word Tolkien in there.
Yes. Oh my, he would flatten me though. I would bring it up and he would just start with the reference. I'd have to like read every single book 3 times in order to keep up with him.
He'll be gentle.
That man is insane.
Don't worry. I've seen him be gentle with people. I also wanted to say, well, just I really enjoyed your description of your journey, and I'm very impressed, and thank you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask, I'm just super curious about how the current political climate, like, because you wrote this book during the mostly during the last administration.
Yep.
And during the transition.
Mm-hmm.
And so from that from Obama to then the last administration. So I'm just wondering.
That shall not be named.
What'd you say?
That shall not be named.
Well, I mean, anyway,
yeah.
So I'm just wondering, you know, I'm just thinking about the idea of, you know, people who are so different from each other, you know, being vulnerable with each other and learning from each other and changing, you know, shifting in the way they think because, or, you know, changing because of each other. And so I don't know, I'm just wondering, you know, whether that affected how you were thinking about people and, you know, human nature at the time.
It did. There was a lot of stuff that happened in the world that made me think, well, first of all, that made me think, what the hell am I doing writing books? You know, like it was sort of hard at a number of times in the last, I don't know, 8 or so years to not just drop everything and like go, you know, canvassing door to door for various things. Um, the one thing that really stood out for me in, you know, people ask me, uh, did world events affect the writing of your book, not just like your feelings as a writer or what it is you're trying to you know, project, but what, you know, the actual, what made it into the book, did that ever get affected? And one almost did, and that was the Syrian refugee crisis. That, you know, suddenly here are these, well, for one thing, like it affected my family personally. You know, my sister-in-law and her husband and their kids were living in Damascus, and they had to flee. But also, you know, seeing these kids on these boats, and it's like, that could be my niece and nephew. They look like my kids, you know, and it was just a very, I had a very personal, you know, reaction to that. And at one point, it like, it made it sort of into a draft of the book, but it didn't work. It didn't do it justice. Part of the problem, and I think we're going to be seeing this now with like sort of post-Trump novels and post-COVID novels, is it usually takes a number of years for large world events to sort of digest before they can be put in a book in a way that doesn't seem like you're, it just seems either too soon or too surface, or wow, you really should have waited a few years and let that sit before you decided to put that into a book. And I knew as I was like one of the characters, actually Dima, at one point I was going to have her more of like a refugee figure, and it didn't do the character justice. And she just sort of became this, it was like I didn't know whether I wanted the reader to feel sorry for her or to be cheering her on. She was just sort of all over the place. And at some point I was like, this is not doing anyone justice at all. It is not doing the refugees justice. It isn't doing her justice. It's just not what belongs in this book. And so I just like reverted it back to the way it was. The thing that, speaking sort of to the larger subject, the thing that sort of sucks about human nature is that we learn from each other on an individual basis, but it doesn't scale very well, I think. You know, and I think there's something about being human where it's like, if you know someone, their life affects you. If you don't know them personally, if something is happening in a far off country or to someone who looks different than you, it's a lot easier to ignore it. And so that, I think the way to, the only way I can see to get around that is to learn about as much, you know, to learn as much and to meet as many different kinds of people as possible. But there's very few, I don't know, ways to really do. I think reading is sort of a poor second. It's maybe one of the few seconds we have, one of the few options we have. You know, there's all these studies about you know, reading making you more of an empathetic person, and I'd like to sort of believe that. But at the same time, I don't know, it can only go so far. And so, yeah, I think the way I keep going forward is just by keep asking questions. And, you know, at some point I decide, okay, my stories are worth something to people. I feel like this is what I am putting into the world that is like the best of me that I can offer. And really that's the best that I can do. And I'll just have to hope that there's enough other people out there who want to learn more about other people, that we can affect change in on some sort of larger personal scale. That's what I got.
Well, I think, you know, I want to just say that, you know, it's a testament really to the power of story, though. And, you know, and I think stories are incredibly powerful, whether they are born out of your, you know, heart and your soul and your head, or whether they're literally lived experiences. And I just want to say, from the position, from the perspective of a Reform rabbi, when I, think about the books that you've written and some of the ideas that you've put out into the universe, so much of what my work is about is trying to figure out, how to take a tradition that's as old as time and to keep it and to hold it close, but also to live in the modern world.
Mhm.
And, how to take these ideas and, and make them live together.
Yeah.
It's like the old and the new, it's the constantly changing and the ever constant.
Mhm.
And I think in your characters, you give us this incredible opportunity to also have that conversation. And I think, and to me, that's what's so, that's what's so interesting about it. When I think about it, I always think, it must be really interesting to be an author and to put all of this into a book. And then, you set it free into the universe, and then people read all sorts of things into what you've written, some of which you intended and some of which you did not.
Mhm.
You never know what your ideas will spark in other people. And so I just want to say to you and give you then the chance for the last word, which I kind of feel like you just had, but I want to give you a chance. Again, I want to just say to you, thank you again for creating these beautiful characters. And I think each one of us is kind of, I know for me, I'm just walking away so blown away by the depth of the thought and the work and the soul that went into creating them and building them. And I don't know, is everyone here still thinking about the cardboard box with the half crescent, and taking the picture? I never even thought about, like, how would you be able to write the perfect description of something? I'll build it, I'm wondering, like, and I was thinking, did she do that with her kids? Were they, or was that like a, did you have
Oh, I
that,
kept them
like,
far, far away.
was that like, was this like a, this is mommy's, diorama?
Yes.
So, so it's an interesting thing. So I just, I think on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you. And, just so you just want to read one comment here, and, that Suzanne just wrote: thank you for your excellent presentation, your thinking, and letting us, your readers, learn what happens next with these characters. So Suzanne, thank you for the perfect way to say thank you. And Helene, if you want to say anything else, and then we'll call it a night.
No, just thank you so much for reading, and thank you for your lovely words. And I hope that we can do this again.
I hope so too. And we can't wait for the next book. A round of applause for this incredible author, friends. And thank you so much. I will be, if you think you have a friend who should learn more about either the Golem and the Genie or the Hidden Palace, this program was recorded, and I will be sending all of you a copy of the program along with the links to buy both books. And also, if you read the book and you loved it, go on to Goodreads and write a review. Let people know how much you like it. It really helps people, discover a beautiful piece of, literature and art and work, so that they can read it too. And of course, it also helps our author. But please do those things and forward. And I don't think I said, and when you get the email from me, feel free to forward it to a friend or 2 or 5 or 10. Just one last announcement, which is our next book talk is March 30th. Instead of at 8 p.m., which is our normal time, it's at 3 p.m. because our author is coming to us from London. And the book is called Ethel Rosenberg by Anne Seba. So I hope that you'll join us for that. You have a little bit of time to read the book in advance if you'd like. And we look forward to seeing you then. Again, thank you so much, Ms. Wecker. This was incredible. The newest book is called The Hidden Palace. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.